Well, good day, everyone. This is, again, second time I've gotten to do this today. Don't mind at all. Enjoy being on here. Enjoy being part of this fellowship and having you guys with me today. Um, it is it is somewhat difficult when things don't exactly go my way, but let's go ahead and jump right in. Today is the 16th of April. This is your daily dose, and we are in the book of James, chapter 4. And we've been looking at chapter 4 for a couple of days now, and considering some of the things that James says, just to kind of, recap what we've talked about the last couple of days. We talked about contentions and wars and fighting. Where do those things come from? And we've talked about, the proper relationship that we should have with God. And when we have that proper relationship with God, how it leads us to a proper relationship, with those who are around us, our fellow human beings. And yesterday we promoted the idea that, we should be all about making that proper relationship, with Him. And we looked specifically at verse 4, where we encourage people to, not have, friendship with the world, because if you do, it creates an enemy of God, and you don't want God as your enemy. Today we're going to go on and begin at chapter 4 and verse 5, and we're going to read down just a few verses to about verse 8 and continue our discussion of this wisdom book of the New Testament, James. James, of course, the half brother of Jesus Christ, writing this book. Verse 5. Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the Scripture says he yearns jealously over the Spirit that has made that he has made to dwell in us? But he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. And we're going to deal with that verse tomorrow, that last one there, but just to kind of set that up. But let's look at verses 5 through 8, and let's connect them for just a minute to what we had said before. James says, look, there's a proper relationship to have with God, and that will lead to a proper relationship with other human beings, but you can't be a friend of the world. If you're a friend of the world, you're the enemy with God. And you know what? Verse 5, God jealously yearns for you. He wants you to be on his side. He wants you to draw near to him. He wants you to come close. That's why the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 55 talks about it over and over, and other places do too. Especially in the Psalms, seek God while he may be found. Long for him, look for him, diligently seek to find him. Even groping for him. God jealously yearns for you. And even when we fail, God will come the distance and to make sure that we find, success. It says that he gives more grace, right? But the thing that he won't bridge is your pride. And we've seen this already in the book of James several times. Pride is the killer of things godly. Pride is the killer of the relationship that we have with God. But if you are humble, then he is going to give you grace, right? He's going to meet you. He's going to meet you where you fail, and he's going to enable you to draw close to him, to resist the devil so that he will flee, and you can have this right and respectful and rewarding relationship with God by his grace, right? But then I want you to look at verse 7. He says, submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. And then I want you to notice these things that he gives us here as benefits. Cleanse your hands. Now, he says that they're things that we do, and of course they are. They're precursors to this. Cleanse your hands. Now, you don't cleanse you, right? You don't clean you spiritually. God does that as we are, submitting to him. But cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Right? So today I want to talk about the kind of the positive side of this conversation. I mean, there's a lot of conversation here about enemy and pride and the proud and how Satan, and we should flee from him. And I kind of all see that as sort of the darker side of these passages. And those things are things that we do need to be concerned about. I mean, if you're a prideful person, dude, you need to deal with that. You need to get that out of your life as quickly as you can. And that's a hard thing to, deal with. But I want us to deal with the positive side of this, and it begins with this idea of submit yourselves, therefore, to God. You know what it means to submit, right? Submit has a couple of different meanings. In the Bible, it typically means to obey or to place yourself under the authority of another. For instance, one of the best examples of this is the indentured servant, right? The indentured servant would, purposely place himself under the authority of an owner or a master. Let's put it that way. And this would enable him to work off any debt, or to, at the end of it all, he would end up, being a person who had his own land to work, who had his own, things that he could accomplish as well. So, they would call them a bond servant, or something along that line in the scripture, right? So, we find that fundamental relationship here. They're willingly submitting. Okay, and God's never going to force you to submit. God's never going to force you to obey His will. If it's not possible for us to say no, then there's no such thing as free will. So He says, "Submit yourselves, therefore, to God." But I want us to consider for just a minute, as we ponder on these passages here in the book of James, the positive side of these things. Now, all of the Bible, I think, is, a positive thing. But I think we can take this and we can really, really, think about think about the things that we gain from it. Think about what we're really doing and how it can, impact our life in a, practical way. Well, I think the first thing that we've got to realize is that when we submit to God, when we obey God, then we are not resisting God, right? You see, you have one of two choices. You can either submit and obey, or you can resist. You can be in the world, or you can be with God. If we are friends with the world, then we are the enemy of God. That's what he said earlier in the chapter, right? There's no, gray line here. There's a very clear mark of distinction. So if we are submitting ourselves, then we're not resisting. Well, what happens to people who resist, God? What happens to people who resist the boundaries that He has created? I mean, just something as simple as, the law of gravity. I mean, God is the creator of that. He's the one who established it. He's the one who established the boundaries for the seas. He's the one who, put the forest on the hills, and, the hills over the valleys, and so on and so forth. He's done all of those things. Well, how well do we do when we fight against things like, gravity, the established, law and boundary of God? Well, we don't do very well. But the same thing is true of His, written word. The same thing is true of His, commands. That men pray everywhere, that we should read, and that we should study, and that we should, seek diligently to show ourselves approved. All of those things are just as important as anything else. So the simple idea that when we submit, then we are not resisting. Means that God is on our side, and He is working for our good. Man, that ought to thrill us. To know that, yeah, man, despite things like coronavirus, despite things like, losing a job, or someone has gotten ill, or all of these things that kind of seem to be plaguing our world right now, the tornadoes in the states north of us, despite all of those things, God has our back, and He is working things to our greatest good. The second thing I want us to think about for just a moment is that when we submit ourselves to our God, we're submitting ourselves to the person who knows us best, right? The other day, well, actually just yesterday, my son Josh ordered a camera. It came. We unpacked it, took it out of its case, grabbed some film, stuck it in the camera, went to hit the button, nothing. So we busted out a couple things, and we tried to do and adjust and, clean off some contacts and stuff like that, put the film back in, tried it, nothing. We realized pretty quickly that we weren't going to be able to fix it. And we, had to find somebody who would. Well, ultimately, the person who would know best how to fix it is the person or the company that made the camera. So you search out for either them or an authorized representative who can actually fix that camera. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to, after having not been able to fix it myself, go to my neighbor across the street who's a crab fisherman give it to him, and he'll tell me, well, I don't know anything about cameras. Well, do your best anyhow. That would be insane. Why would I ever want to do that? Well, the same thing is true spiritually, right? When we want to take our problems somewhere who can really solve them, we got to go to God. When it comes to our difficulties, if we really want to solve them, if we really want wisdom, if we really want understanding, then we're going to take these things to God because He knows best. That's why it said He's working good, right? He's working things to the best outcome, for us, right? So there are also some consequences that we avoid, and I see these as not consequences, but I shouldn't say avoid, but there are consequences that we avoid, but there are consequences that are positive too. Number one, when we submit ourselves to God, then we can actually bring peace into this world. Can you imagine if everybody in this world would just simply heed that one command to be at peace with all men, right? Wow. I mean, how much better would the world be? If everybody just simply, held to the idea that greater love has no man than to lay down his life for his friends. Can you imagine how that would change the world? Can you imagine if we were all actually peacemakers? We would bring peace into the world because our God is a God of peace. And you could say this about any quality or characteristic of God, because those are the things that we put ourselves in line for when we submit ourselves to God. God is of loving character. God is of truthful character. God is of, and you can go on and on and on and list those things. And those are the natural consequences. But then the last thing I want to mention is that we bring happiness. Or, well, maybe the happiness is not the right word. Maybe joy. Happiness can be fleeting and is based on our situation. Joy is kind of a settled, a settled peace despite our situation, because we have fully rested in God, if that makes sense to you. Joy is a peace and prosperity by having a relationship with God. You can have joy even when everything is going wrong. When the world is collapsing around you, you can still have joy. And I think that's one of the natural consequences to submitting to God. So the question is, have you? Right? I mean, have you submitted to Him? Well, you'll know. Look at your life. Is your life consistently found in things like worship, prayer? Do you read the Bible? Do you meditate on it? Do you have a faith? And what exactly is this faith? Do you really believe in God? Have you been baptized? Do you confess the name of Christ? Do you go out and are you evangelistic? Do you find yourself growing spiritually? All of these are kind of like spiritual tests that you can do in order to determine, have I submitted to God? Or maybe you want to do it the kind of opposite way. Is there any part of my life that I've not given to Him? Is there any part of my life where I've said, no, God, I'm not giving you that part? Then we haven't fully submitted. If we can find just one thing, one area, one avenue that's going to lead us away from God. You remember the rich young ruler was told that. This one thing you lack. And he was caught up on his wealth. And his wealth was the most important thing from him. So Christ said, sell all you have, give it to the poor, come and follow me. And he went away sad because he had much wealth. So have we submitted to God? Have we submitted everything to God? That's the question I encourage you to ask yourself, as I encourage you to remember that if you have, man, you're in no greater position. God has your back. The consequences of it bring peace and joy. And you're giving yourself to the person who knows what is best for you. I appreciate you coming out today. This has been your Daily Dose.